Morning guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. New angles have emerged of Max Verstappen's crash with George Russell at the Spanish Grand Prix that seem to confirm what we may have already known. Russell after the Grand Prix said he felt it was deliberate. Max even implied it after the race, and now the onboard seems to tell a very similar story indeed. This raises serious questions, especially given that Horner says that Max apologised to the team after the race and even came very close himself, Max, today, of actually apologising on social media, which you very rarely ever see. Could this have been a far more severe punishment? That's the big discussion of the day, given that Max is now only one penalty point away from a race ban, and he's got a couple of races at the least to be on his best behaviour. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I would greatly appreciate it. We're going to start here. Franco Colapinto has had a tricky return to Formula 1. His first few Grand Prix with Williams last year were no doubt excellent compared to expectations. After that, he somewhat fell off a little bit, and his return to the grid with Alpine has been far from stellar. Has he been any better than Doohan? No, not as far as I'm concerned. Not like Doohan was great, and I understand the change, especially because of the money involved, but Briatore says that he's not particularly happy with Colapinto's performances thus far. Gasly scored a handful of points on the weekends, finishing P8 in Spain. Colapinto, yes, he had the issue in Q1, which is very unfortunate, but even after then it was largely anonymous for the majority of the Grand Prix. So could Colapinto get replaced? That to me seems relatively unlikely. The feeling even in the article still is that due to various other factors, it's unlikely that he's going anywhere. But Alpine themselves did even say that he's got this kind of 5-race contract, so we'll see, because driver changes mid-season may not be over just yet. Couple of words on Ferrari. Hamilton, of course, had a pretty respectable qualifying, out-qualifying Charles Leclerc, but the Grand Prix was a bit of a disaster from start to finish. Hamilton even went to say that it was the worst race that he's ever experienced from the perspective of balance in the car. Now, you know, Hamilton's funny like this, isn't he, right? Like every weekend, he seems to just forget about the rest of his career, and every weekend is either the best race ever or the worst race ever, because he had a great time in Imola, and then a couple of weekends later to finish out the triple header, it's not gone to plan. The remarkable thing is, though, for Ferrari, is that they are now second in the Constructors' Championship. Mercedes scored only like 18 points over the triple header. Ferrari have actually done pretty well. I don't know, like, it seems surprising they've got into second. I think it is testament to the drivers they have that that's where they are, given the car that they presently have. Hamilton wasn't very happy about it and says, you know, hopefully things will get better in future. Hamilton even was pretty down and said, you know, I don't think they'll find any answers. But actually, it turns out they did find some answers, because Vasseur said that Hamilton had some floor damage in the second stint and it threw the balance all over the place. Very interesting, though, because Hamilton earlier in the weekend said that they had an issue with their floor that really just affected the balance, and they fixed it for practice 3 in qualifying. But during the race, it seemed like that was either back again or it was something else that was affecting the balance. Seems like the Ferrari is very, very prone to something going wrong with it and making it borderline undrivable. Even, let's just keep this in mind, in the final stint of the race after the safety car, Nico Hülkenberg was not just faster than Hamilton, he was also faster than Charles Leclerc. And there was some talk that maybe Leclerc had a slight issue as well that was affecting his pace. I think the key takeaway was that Hülkenberg had brand spanking new fresh soft tyres. The reason why he had them was because he went out in Q1. So actually he had a boatload of soft tyres still left to use, which other teams really didn't. So pretty funny to think about that in hindsight, right? That actually Hülkenberg was helped out by the fact that he went out in Q1 and had loads of soft tyres to deploy, and they made a big difference around here. That's why the big debate on whether Red Bull should have pitted or not, whether they should have left Max out on the older soft tyres. I think the general feeling is that they may have done the right thing going to the hard. You know, Red Bull's strategy team rarely makes mistakes. I think they made a mistake in terms of what they said to Max on the radio. We'll get into that again in a second. But there's some debate as to whether staying out on the older softs would have been worthwhile or not, because newer softs were worth a lot of lap time. But would Max have finished, you know, 5th with the, you know, if he'd have stayed out and started first and tried to hold on? You know, I think he probably would have finished better than he did. And obviously the incident was a large part of that. Now, Leclerc secured his P3 in the end. They did get away with the incident between Leclerc and Max on the straight. I thought it was a racing incident. That's what the stewards decided as well. They said both drivers were of the view that this was an avoidable collision and could potentially result in a major crash, but neither driver was wholly or predominantly to blame. So, look, they effectively just wrote it off, and I thought that was probably the right decision at the time. One final thing on Ferrari before we talk about the Max drama. They will have upgrades in Canada, apparently. A new floor is on the way, and potentially the new rear suspension. Now, this has been the big talking point. They want to change the rear suspension. That's been the big upgrade that Loic, Sarah and the team have been working on. Hamilton very excited about finally getting some upgrades actually on the car. The technical directive this weekend didn't do anything, and Hamilton wasn't very happy about that either, saying that it was just a big waste of money really, because nothing's changed in the competitive order, but it's meant that the team's about to spend loads of money on developing all these new parts. But Ferrari have some changes coming. The initial rumour was that the rear suspension was going to arrive for Silverstone, and that's in a couple of Grand Prix time. Canada, Austria, stuff like this. But apparently they may have been able to fast track it slightly earlier. So that could be a positive sign. Whether it actually works or not as intended, that is a rather different question. But let's talk about the drama, because Russell Max was a big talking point at the end of last year. I will say as well, I really hope we get a title fight between these two at some point. It would just be like, the content would be endless. And I don't know, whenever these two are next to each other on the track, I don't know if the fact that it was George caused Max to get even more mad. Possibly. I don't know if he'd have done it to another driver. Would he have done it to Charles? Okay, let's just think about this, right? Let's say Charles Leclerc sends it down the inside of Max into turn one after the safety car. Obviously, in this case, Charles was already past him. But let's say it was actually Charles in Russell's car. And because we know that Max and Charles are pretty good friends, they seem to have a better relationship between each other, and certainly with Max, than many of the other drivers do with Max from a wheel-to-wheel racing perspective. Let's say it was Leclerc who pushed Verstappen off the track. Does Max send one down the inside into, turn 5 and play the move that he did on Russell? I don't know. I think there was something in Max's eyes where he saw a Mercedes and he was like, I just want to crash into somebody right now, especially when it was George Russell involved. So anyway, we saw the reaction yesterday. Russell said it was surprising. I don't know what he was thinking. Max says, was the move intentional? Does it matter? Of course it does. But look, Max was not denying. He didn't outright say, he didn't lie about it, right? Max came out and said nothing really of particular substance, which probably tells you all that you need to know. Because if he didn't crash into George deliberately, then he probably would have said so, but he kind of refused to comment and say much, which probably gives you what you need to know. Max says, I don't need to say anything about it. Russell says he cost himself and his team a whole lot of points. Obviously Max is carrying Red Bull, but he's not necessarily wrong in the constructors that this was a costly one. Russell even plays what is nowadays the classic card of when, Sky Sports said it, Russell said it, to say, look, for the kids out there watching at home that idolise, a hero, maybe in their eyes is Max Verstappen, maybe it's not a good thing to deliberately crash into another car in, what would be considered rather dangerous driving. I will also mention, before I forget, last year's incident with Lando Norris back in Mexico was, in some respects very similar, arguably worse, to be honest. It's just on that occasion, Lando got out of it, right? He got out of the way and they didn't collide. Whereas, in this case, George Russell didn't, get out of the way and leave the track entirely, so they did collide, right? And okay, that wasn't as high speed. This past weekend was not as high speed as Mexico, but I think in many respects the incidents have to be treated relatively similarly, which is why I'm somewhat surprised by the, I would say, lenient penalty that Max Verstappen accrued in this case. We'll discuss why that may have happened in a second, or what they should do about it instead. But Russell effectively gave the whole, well, he's a role model and therefore what would the kids think? Max just says, F them kids, okay, I'm bringing some tissues next time. So I thought that was pretty funny, right? Look, it's Max Verstappen. This is what he's like, and Russell was pretty clear after the Grand Prix that as far as he was concerned, he felt this was a deliberate intention from Max to pretend to let him through, as the team had ordered, and then deciding that actually no, to prove a point, or because, he was just seeing red or whatever, he was going to deliberately crash into George, maybe as he felt like George had done to him at turn 1. Max even said in another interview, he was asked the question the plan was to let George through, right? And Max says, yeah, that was the plan. So, Max admits that, he obviously was frustrated on the radio. He'd made the decision, it seems, in his own head to let Russell through. And then as soon as he saw that Mercedes in his mirrors, he decided, actually, no, I'm not going to do this. This is what I'm going to do instead. And in a moment of madness, that's what we saw. And Max isn't really denying that, right? I don't think there's any debate on whether this was intentional or not. I think it was 100% intentional. I can't really see another explanation for not only the onboard we're about to see, but also Max's comments. If it wasn't deliberate, he would say that it wasn't deliberate, and it was a misjudgment or carried too much speed or whatever. And maybe he did call it a misjudgment, but I think it was a misjudgment in some other way. Now, we got some penalty points too. That will be interesting in a second. But Horner does reveal that on 2 occasions, really, Max has actually apologized for this. The first article here was not really an article, but this is Christian Horner's post that he just threw up there on Instagram. And he says, Spain closed the triple header, etc., etc. But this is the point, really. The result that followed was frustrating because it was looking to be an easy podium for Max and good championship points. Max apologised in the debrief for his incident with Russell. The safety car also hurt Yuki's race. So that's the key bit, really, that Horner reveals that Max came into the debrief room and said, look, yeah, that was my bad for, making that decision that I made and costing the team a load of points. And even Max went on to say something that you very rarely hear from Max, which is nearly an apology. Now, of course, people are going to debate, well, did he really say this, right? Like, are these his words? Is this a PR statement, right? But I do think that when stuff goes to the personal Instagram, Max will at the very least approve this message. It won't just be posted. And I think the way that it's said is very Max Verstappen, because he's not quite apologising, but also, he's not completely ignoring it. So he says, our tyre choice at the end and some moves after the safety car restart fueled my frustration, leading to a move that was not right and shouldn't have happened. So I think that's about as close as you're ever going to get to Max Verstappen apologising for an incident. The move was not right and the move shouldn't have happened. That's how he describes it. I'll give everything out there for the team, and emotions can run high. You win some together, you lose some together. Back to it in Montreal. So this is the onboard, right? So we finally have this. I know there was lots of talk about it because during the Grand Prix itself, we only had the rear-facing view of Max Verstappen's car, but they have to download everything, and then we got the front-facing view. So at this point, Max decides that he's going to let him through. So there's Charles Leclerc in front. He's struggling with the hard tyres. He comes around the end of turn 4 and then decides, okay, I'm going to slow down, pull to the left-hand side. George Russell goes past on the right-hand side, as you guys can see. And then this is where Max, makes his decision to go in. Now, look, the funny thing about this is, of course, that technically the overtake from George wasn't complete. And if we look at all of the information here, Max is well enough alongside going into the corner. I mean, is his car out of control? This is another question, but he's, well enough inside at the apex. So, on some level, this is kind of like a legal move. But of course, what's not legal about it is the seeming deliberate intention to crash into another car and make the corner by effectively hitting another car as the brakes. So the reason, what to watch out for here, by the way, is look at Max's helmet. That's really what you want to look for, and his steering angle. So Russell is now along him on the right-hand side, and as Max is turning into this corner, he sends it in very aggressively, very deep. And look at the amount of times he checks where Russell is. So he's looking to his right. He sees Russell to his right. He looks back to the road. He then, as he hits the brakes here, braking for the corner, not really turning in. And he turns in now. And he turns in just as he has his final check to the right. This is what I find kind of damning about this onboard, is look at Max's head position, right? So as he's coming into the corner, Russell's on his outside, he's braking really deep, and right here, he has a look to his right. So at this moment, this is when Max starts to turn. When he's looked to his right, he sees George again, and at this point, he knows he's going to crash into George. And he's just checking that he is going to crash into George, and that's exactly what we see. And then as soon as he knows, he looks to his right, sees George, knows that he's gone in very deep. He had really no steering angle on at all as he was going into this corner here. He hits George, and at the moment that he knows he's going to hit him, then he cranks on the steering lock, then he gets back to where he's looking, and then of course at this point they make contact, and the rest is history since then. He then looks at him again in the rear mirror to see where George has gone. So, if you look at it in full speed, just looking at Verstappen's head angle here, and okay, he looks to his right, he then looks to his right there as he crashes into George, and then he checks his mirror again as he leaves, just to kind of be like, yeah, I'd make sure that I did hit him, did I do any damage type thing. Look, that's just my interpretation of it, but I don't really think you can watch this and think that it wasn't deliberate, because, he slows down on the left-hand side to let Russell past. He sees George come into the mirrors, and I just think has a moment where he's like, you know what, screw this guy. I'm just going to send it in. He has this final little look to the right-hand side here, right there. He has this little little look to the right to see that he's about to crash into George's car, and that's what he does. And look, it's one of those moments that, as far as I understand, as far as George sees it, even as Max, I mean, look, Max apologizes for this effectively in a way that we very rarely see Max do. He says the move shouldn't have happened, the emotions run high, which is as close as you're going to get to Max admitting that he effectively did this on purpose. And I don't really think the onboard gives us that much more information, but I think it makes it kind of clear what we already know. Look, people are going to disagree on that statement. Like, everyone's, of course, entitled to their own opinion. My perspective is this is a deliberate crash. And like, I don't know. That's just my opinion. You guys may disagree. Nico Rosberg felt the same way. And he thought that it should have been a black flag. Now, black flag is disqualification. Black flag is only handed out in a couple of instances. These are the black flags in the history of Formula 1. Hulkenberg got one last year, you guys might remember, for receiving physical assistance getting back to the track. He was disqualified for that. And the other instances of black flags being waved have largely just been for egregious rule violations. So, you know, Schumacher 1994, British Grand Prix ignoring the stop-go penalty, and we've seen other examples of something similar to that. So these are the black flags. It's never really happened for a crash or some sort of driving standards issue during the Grand Prix, but disqualifications for that type of instance have happened. And I think the big debate is because people see a bit of Senna and a bit of Schumacher in a guy like Max, the way that he drives. I think the big debate as of today, though, is, okay, what should the punishment be? What should the punishment have been? Is Max kind of allowed to get away with this stuff? Because I do feel like when Max does something outrageous, he doesn't often get punished as he should. Now, not necessarily to say that there's bias in the stewards room, but it just feels like Red Bull are never going to hold Max accountable, right? It is what it is. You know, Marco, Horner, Max can effectively do whatever he wants and the team will still defend him. That's like how it's felt for years, and I don't really think that's ever going to change. So if Max is going to like stop driving it this way, and maybe he never will, but I do think that there's an argument that he could or should be held accountable more for incidents like this. If you believe that this was a deliberate crash with another car, you know, that is potentially grounds for dangerous driving on a level for which we have seen disqualifications and worse in the past. The point that I'm making really here is that when Senna crashed into Prost in Suzuka 1989, and it's still a very controversial incident, this one, you know, whether you think by the driving standards guidelines what was fair, what was not fair, but Senna, having got on to complete the Grand Prix, was then disqualified and banned for 6 months as a result of this incident. It was a suspended ban, but he got disqualified from this race, and he was banned for 6 months. And that's Ayrton Senna. This is Michael Schumacher famously crashing into Jacques Villeneuve in Jerez 1997, I believe, and Villeneuve went on to win the title. The only way that Schumacher could have won was effectively at this point to take his rival out and try and win the race. This actually cost Michael the race, but also he was disqualified from the entire championship. His whole season of work was, written away from him because of this incident. So, look, we've seen great champions of the past do very controversial things. And of course, these moments were real championship deciding moments. So it's maybe understandable why they were punished very severely. And the fact that Russell's car was generally okay and he still finished ahead of Max anyway, that shouldn't really matter, right? Like, if you're looking at these, incidents and saying, well, Verstappen's just doing what Schumacher and Senna have done at times in the past, well, they got punished for those incidents, right? And, you could argue that a 10-second penalty is not necessarily sufficient. I think what confuses me again a little bit about this is that he was given 3 penalty points, and that is a lot of penalty points. Like, for this collision, that is a lot, right? Now, which would potentially imply that a harsher in-race penalty may have been justified. Like, I think a drive-through, maybe a 10-second stop and go would have been, justified. I'm not sure I would agree with Nico to say he should have been black flagged or disqualified, but I certainly think that a harsher penalty than a 10 seconds was necessary. And the stewards, I don't know, it's confusing, right? Because the stewards on some level seem to almost agree, because they've given him 3 penalty points for this incident, which is more than he was received for anything for the last year. So clearly they think that it was harsh. Of course, they give him 3, which leaves him 1 shy of a race ban. And these are his points that he's accrued over the last year or so. So the collision with Lando in Austria, that was 2 points. Collision with Lando, or forcing him off the track in Mexico, that was 2 points. Got 1 point for a couple of things at Sao Paulo in Qatar. got a couple at Abu Dhabi for that first lap collision with Oscar, and now he's got 3 here in Spain. That brings him up to 11 points, and it will be until, the end of June, so he's got 2 more Grand Prix until those first 2 get removed, and even then he'll still be on 9 points, so he's got to be careful, even up until October, that he doesn't do anything crazy. So fascinated to hear your thoughts in the comment section below, because Max, comes out and is seemingly almost apologetic about it, which I think is fair enough from Max's side, but then the question will be, and there's talk here about the fact that when Hamilton was fined for crossing the track in Qatar, there was a lot of talk about, oh, well, he is an important person, making sure he's a role model for younger drivers, and therefore his fine is going to be greater. Surely the FIA should think similarly about other drivers as well, and that's why this debate is going to, I imagine, continue to rage on, because, maybe Mercedes could even put in some sort of an appeal, but, then again, I don't really think that even they want Max to get bans, because then he might just decide, what, screw this, I'm going to leave Formula 1, and then Mercedes can't sign him for next year. He's still the fastest driver on the grid. So, yeah, it's another crazy weekend of Formula 1. Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.